All right. Well, I think we're going to get going. I want to welcome you. My name is Jonathan Kays. I'm a Natural Resource Extension Specialist with the University of Maryland Extension. This is the first in a series of webinars, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. University of Maryland Extension is the outreach part of the University of Maryland College Park, College of Agricultural and Natural Resources. Our agenda for today with this webinar is a 1-hour webinar. We'll be done at 1, but if people want to hang around and for questions, that will be just fine as well. We're using a technology called Adobe Connect that you see on your screen, and you basically have a main screen which will have the PowerPoint presentation. You can see an attendee list. You can also see my picture there. And you have a chat box, and the chat box is basically how we communicate. If you have a question, please provide that in the box, and you can also send messages privately to us as well. So that's our format. This is part of a series, wildlife series, and the other 3 are listed here on turkey biology, on non-game wildlife, as well as young forest wildlife, and we have very qualified Department of Natural Resources wildlife professionals making those presentations, and myself or one of my colleagues will be moderating these sessions. So full details on that are available at our website at www.naturalresources.umd.edu. In terms of the webinar, how this works, we have a separate listserv for Forest Service education webinars, and it's email notification. If you're interested in being on that list, if you're not on it already, you can send it to the email address indicated on the slide, or you can contact Andrew Kling, and he would be happy to put you on that list as well. The way the webinar works is we have room for about 100 people. I see we have about 28 right now, and we'll see, maybe we'll have some more. All webinars are recorded. I'm recording this right now, and it will be posted on our website. When you go to naturalresources.umd.edu, on the upper left you'll see a link for resources, and then under there a link for webinar recordings. But you can also find it on the YouTube channel under the University of Maryland FSE, which stands for Forest Stewardship Education. If you have a question during the webinar, feel free. We use the chat box for that, and our speaker may be able to address the question as he goes along if he can take care of that. Otherwise, we will be providing him the questions at various times during the presentation, or we can do it at the end. And if you don't get your question answered, we will try and email you later, but I think we should be able to answer all the questions. If you have any questions, as a follow-up or anything, then you should feel free to email Andrew Kling, whose email address you see on the slide. Our website looks like this. It's a little small, but on the upper left, I have a under here, you can't really see it too well, but there's a link for resources, and under there would be webinar recordings. And again, you can go to the YouTube channel as well. Before we get going, I just want to take a quick initial poll before we get going. And if you would bear with me, just to find out a little bit about who you are. So what you'll see come up is a poll, and I'll open it like this one here. It says, what state do you live in? If you would just click on that, we'll get an idea of where our audience is coming from, and that will just help us a good bit. So we can see that about half of the folks online are coming from Maryland, and a larger number from Pennsylvania, as well as a few from other states as well. Okay, so I'm going to close that poll. The other question is, Question is, how did you find out about this webinar? If you could just indicate to us, that would help us a good bit in terms of how we market this program. Obviously, most people, I guess, get it from email. Okay, that's good. And I will close that poll as well. And another question we have here is just to get an idea of, we're offering this, as distance education, but we're curious if you had to travel to your county extension office, and I would hope you know where that is. If not, it would be probably where your county seat is. That's where most extension offices are, in many cases. But how far would you have to travel to get to that location? And that just gives us an idea in terms of how convenient these sessions are. So you can see that most people are probably within 5 miles of their local extension office. Okay. Just a couple more quick questions. How much land do you own? And I can see we have some larger landowners as well as smaller ones, and that's a good mix of folks. All right, and 2 more quick questions. Do you currently manage for wildlife on your property? Most everybody is probably going to say, well, some people do not, and hopefully this seminar would be useful for them. Okay, and finally, I have one other question, and that's this one. Do you hunt or trap wildlife? We're just curious in terms of some folks are hunters and trappers, and I'm just curious the distribution of people. All right, so kind of evens out. All right, well, thank you for your patience with doing this preliminary poll. At the very end, we will have a couple of questions, which we really would encourage you to answer, just like 4 or 5 questions, and that would be very helpful to us. Right now, what you'll see coming up is the PowerPoint. I'm going to take my picture off, and what you're going to see is a picture of Jim Mullan, who is going to be our presenter. And I'm going to just take a minute to give him the microphone here, the headset as we do it, and he will start the presentation and we'll get going. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? If someone would indicate on the screen, please. All right, thank you very much. Again, I'm a wildlife biologist with Maryland Department of Natural Resources. I'm also an adjunct professor of wildlife at Garrett College in Maryland. Today we're going to talk about principles of wildlife ecology and management with an emphasis on wildlife habitat and habitat in the backyard. Okay. Maryland is known as America in miniature, and that's due to the fact that we have so many different types of landscapes, from our mountains to the Blue Ridge to the Piedmont Plateau to our coastal plain. A wide diversity of habitats, and because of that diversity, we're well represented with diversity of wildlife, fish, invertebrate, and plant species. So today we're going to talk about some of the fundamentals of ecology and management. We'll look at some examples of different habitat, and then look at some habitat management practices and see what kind of benefits or impacts they have on wildlife. If you're preparing to manage your own property, there's some questions you need to ask yourself. First of all, why is that property important to you? Do you plan to use it to hunt or fish or maybe bird? Do you hope to get some kind of an income from it? Is it just a nice place to live? You like it for the aesthetic value, or you just want to do your part for the conservation movement? The big question as you think about these things is, can I accomplish anything significant? Step 1 in managing your property would basically be to do a habitat inventory. Now, if you have a forest stewardship plan for your property, a lot of this work has already been done. Otherwise, you have a great tool available via the internet, and that's Google Earth, where you can actually zoom in on your area, your property, and get a real good handle on what that property looks like from a landscape view. First of all, you want to determine what type of forests you may have, whether they're hardwoods or conifers, the approximate age, and how they fit into the landscape context. If you have wetlands, there's different categories of wetlands. You want to learn a little more about that. If you have open areas such as fields, whether they're crop or pasture lands, good to inventory those things, and other habitat features which we'll talk more about, such as rivers, streams, rock outcrops, hedgerows, things like that. Okay. After you do your habitat inventory, it's a good idea to do a species inventory. And this is essentially making a list of what species may occur on the property. And at the end of this presentation, we have some useful links of species lists common to Maryland. Okay. You might want to look at some of the different types of habitats or communities that are found there. Look for invasive species that you may need to control. And then ask questions about, are there certain laws or regulations that you may need a permit to do that. And lastly, you want to develop a timeline. When we talk about wildlife habitat, we need to understand size requirements for different wildlife species. For instance, grassland and forest interior bird species need large habitat blocks. The grasshopper sparrow you see in the upper left-hand picture needs anywhere from tens to thousands of acres of grass or meadow habitat. Similarly, the wood thrush that you see in the lower right-hand corner needs extensive areas of large older forest. If your property is not that large, we can connect several properties together, and by combining those, we do provide a larger habitat for things like forest interior species, which are dependent upon large forest landscapes. Okay. Contrary to that, certain species such as edge species, which edge is where two different habitat types come together, or early successional species, which generally use younger stage forests, they generally can use smaller, more diverse blocks of habitat. Migratory birds can use just about any type of quality habitat as stopover area. And for instance, if we talk about the magnolia warbler, its summer range is in northern U.S. and Canada. However, it migrates in the wintertime to Central America. During these migrations back and forth, these birds may use stopover areas anywhere there's suitable habitat. We also have to talk a little bit about common home ranges and abundance. For instance, if we talk about a chipmunk may spend its whole life living on a small half-acre parcel, and therefore it's not uncommon to find, say, 2 to 4 chipmunks per acre. If we compare that, for instance, to the black bear, and a male black bear requires anywhere from 60 to 100 square miles of habitat within its home range, our population densities are going to be much lower. So we may only find about 70 bears per 100 square miles. So again, we have to think about the habitat requirements and size for these species. The basic components of wildlife habitat are 4 things. It's food, it's water, it's cover, all arranged in a suitable amount of space so that all those necessary elements may be available within that animal's home range. In terms of habitat management strategies, if you currently have high quality habitat, the best thing we can do is protect it. If the habitat is okay, there may be some enhancement methods you can look at. Marginal habitat, we probably want to do some alteration. And if you have poor quality habitat, then restoration efforts would be in order. If you're starting from scratch, say a mowed yard or a brownfield, then you're actually going to start creating habitat. Again, some more habitat requirements. Talk about our black bear. Primary habitat requirements for the eastern black bear are deciduous and mixed forests interspersed with openings and wetlands. Whereas the bobwhite quail requires more agricultural or open lands with croplands and grasslands, a little bit of woodlands and brush mixed in. When we talk about our amphibian friends such as this wood frog, they require different types of habitat. For instance, they require small vernal or temporary pools for the breeding, but then woodland habitats for the non-breeding season. When we talk about wildlife elements of wildlife habitat, we're generally trying to figure out which factor is in the least supply, or as we say it, which is the limiting factor. Some examples of cover would be things like caves and ledges, cavities, snags, treetops, dense vegetation, brush piles. For food, we can talk about hard and soft mast. Mast is a term that's used to represent either nuts or fruits that are found in woodlands, apple trees, acorns, berries, things like that. Water is another requirement of all living things. Wetlands, riparian zones, spring seeps, rivers are all examples of elements of wetland habitat. And space, all these elements need to be arranged in a suitable area that the animal can utilize them. Another concept we need to talk about is the fact that habitat changes with the season. During the summer, most of our deciduous forests are lush, full of leaves, full of herbaceous material on the ground. Come wintertime, we see a much more barren landscape. Similarly, if we look at our meadows or fields, we've got a lot of dense grass and legume growth. Come wintertime, after they've been harvested or that growth has died off, there's not a lot of cover available. And so we want to try to maintain and enhance habitat elements wherever we can. Mast trees, most forest wildlife dependent species require some type of food from masts. So edible fruits, nuts, acorns, hickories, walnuts, things like that are very important to retain. Rocks, and it could be a large individual rock, it could be a cliff, an outcropping, or rock piles are also very important elements. Snags, which are simply dead standing trees, water as we talked about, and then wolf trees. Wolf trees are usually large spreading trees that have been that are long-lived and have a very open canopy. Some other resources to talk about: vernal pools we mentioned earlier, and these are seasonal wetlands, typically do not support fish populations, and for that reason are very important breeding areas for amphibians such as salamanders. Coarse woody debris, as you see in the lower right slide there, this is basically down logs or or nurse logs that provide habitat for insects as well as amphibians. And certainly snags, as you see in the left-hand slide. In this case, the snag has a cavity and you see an owl peeking out of it. Some other elements that are commonly found: rock outcrops, cliffs, and talus slopes. These types of habitats provide homes for some of our rare and threatened and endangered species, such as the eastern wood rat, as you see in the upper right-hand corner, or the timber rattlesnake, as you see on the left side. Where you have these rock outcrops or talus slopes, we encourage you to maintain forested buffers around these. These are very unique types of habitats. Okay, some other unique habitats are shale barrens. Very rare, found primarily in western Allegheny County. These are home to places like the fence lizard, or fens or wet meadows, as you see. These are home for certain species. So the question to ask yourself is, what species or groups of species should you manage for? And generally the best advice is to manage for quality habitat. Some of the guiding principles that we'll recommend, and here we want to start from large to small, landscape to local level: regional priorities, and we'll talk about a few of those. Next would be any state species of greatest concern, rare, threatened, or protected species, and species with special habitat requirements. And finally, we have to consider the landowner's objectives. One group of species that's a regional priority are forest interior dwelling bird species. There's approximately 25 different bird species that are very sensitive to forest conditions. They're generally associated with pole stage or older saw timber size forest conditions. And habitat size is very critical to them. Generally, you're going to need at least 50-acre tract with little or minimal amount of interior edge. Okay, FIDS, the acronym we use for forest interior dwelling species, basically serve as an umbrella for other forest obligate species. This is an example of what we'd call FIDS habitat. Generally, you're looking for a large percentage of canopy closure, in this case 80%, large contiguous blocks of forest, and very dense vertical structure within the subcanopy. Some other sensitive habitats common here to Maryland are Delmarva bays, which are located on the eastern shore, and vernal pools, which are found throughout the state. Again, these are seasonally flooded, non-tidal wetlands. And you can see in January what a Delmarva bay would look like, and then again in June. So they're seasonal, but they provide important habitat, and especially breeding habitat, for different invertebrates and turtles as well as amphibian species. Grassland birds are actually a national priority. Among all bird species, they're suffering the greatest decline, and it's been attributed primarily to the lack and degradation of habitat. Generally, you need at least 10 acres of grassland habitat to support these species with minimal edge, so generally circles or square-shaped habitat pieces work best. Some of the species, such as the bobolink, meadowlark, and Henslow sparrows, are suffering decreased declines in their populations. Another group that's a regional priority are young forest birds, and there'll be another seminar series on this topic later. But essentially, birds such as woodcock, and we do singing ground surveys for woodcock nationwide. We're generally seeing about a 2% decline in their population per year. Okay. When we talk about wildlife and wildlife populations, we need to talk about a subject called carrying capacity. And carrying capacity can be defined as a number of animals a given unit of land can support at any particular time. So this bathtub model is a good idea, a good way to look at carrying capacity. Upper top right-hand corner, you see population input. Those are animals that are being born into that population or migrating in from somewhere else. At a certain point, that land cannot support those excess animals. So we need to have a mechanism to remove those animals from the population as well. So if you look at the lower left-hand side of the slide, you see population outputs, deaths and migration out of that particular habitat. And those mortality factors such as death could be from pollution, starvation, predators, weather, old age, accidents, or in modern wildlife management we use hunting to supplement some of those mortality factors. So the population is best balanced when the number of animals coming into the habitat is equal to or less than the number of animals that are coming out of the habitat. Okay, let's look at another example. And in nature, absent any type of mortality, just looking at robins. If we start out with one breeding pair of robins, and the first year they produce 6 young, by the end of that year, the end of that summer, we would have a total of 8 robins. Now drop down to the bottom of the screen, and after 5 years, we would have 256 breeding pairs of robins, producing approximately 1,536 offspring for a total of 2,048 robins. You can imagine that going on, say, after 20 years, and imagine that with all the other species on the landscapes. Absent mortality, we would be up to our ears in wildlife. This is a typical wildlife population curve with number of animals on the y-axis and the months of the year on the x-axis. And generally, most young are produced typically in the late spring, early summer. So as you look at our population curve, we start with our low level of breeding stock in April, but by July, we've reached a peak population. Okay, between July and the next April, we see where mortality or death factors have caused the population to decline. And this is pretty typical if you think of the example of cottontail rabbits. You'll see very few rabbits, say, in the wintertime when typically carrying capacity is near its lowest. But come midsummer, you've got rabbits everywhere, baby rabbits running around. But then predators, accidents, and other factors start to cause a population decline. When we look at this slide in terms of carrying capacity, the carrying capacity for this piece of habitat, the biological carrying capacity, I should say, generally is going to be where we see our level of breeding stock, and then on the right-hand side, surviving breeding stock. So death is definitely a part of nature. As populations approach the carrying capacity, one or more mortality factors is likely to occur. And the higher the population, the greater the likelihood of, say, a disease having an effect, or starvation, especially during a very severe winter. And generally, wildlife managers will use hunting to compensate for these other mortality factors, remove those animals out of the population and allow people to utilize them as opposed to them dying and being left on the landscape. When we talk about habitat and the components, when we approach the problem of how we're going to manage the habitat, generally we need to identify that limiting factor or that component that's in the least supply, because the limiting factor is going to basically determine what biological carrying capacity is for that species. Okay, another concept to talk about is succession. And you may be familiar with this as plant succession or field succession. Generally speaking, when we talk about succession, we're talking about, oops, try to get my cursor up here. Okay, here we're talking about a common backyard setting, low-growing grasses or forbs. If we were to let that yard grow for a few years, suddenly we get more meadow-type species. Let it go a few more years, we're starting to get some small seedlings and saplings coming in, some shrubs. We allow those to grow, and suddenly we see some changes in the vertical diversity of that stand. The trees and shrubs are getting larger, eventually growing into a mature forest landscape. For each of these different successional stages, as we call them, we find certain species that are more common. For instance, we talked earlier about our grassland species, grasshopper, sparrow, meadowlark, bobolink. All those would commonly be found in here. As we move to our older forest setting, we're finding wild turkeys, gray squirrels, black bear, white-tailed deer, some other species like that. So wildlife have different successional stage requirements. We can use that knowledge to manipulate habitats and make them more beneficial for certain species or species groups. I mentioned earlier the concept of edge, and edge is the interface between two or more different cover types or vertical covers. Edges tend to be areas where you have a lot of wildlife activity and a lot of wildlife diversity. On the left side here, we have what we call a hard edge. And this would be an example of, say, a mowed yard coming up and interacting with a mature forest. This transitional area here we refer to as a hard edge because, again, there's an abrupt change in the vertical height between the grass and the trees. This slide over here, we see more of a meadow setting, interacting or adjoining an area where we have shrubs growing and small trees, adjacent to an area of more mature trees. Because the vertical transition in these habitats is much more gradual, we refer to this as a soft edge. As wildlife managers, we tend to recommend managing for primarily soft edges as opposed to hard, although there are some exceptions to the rule. Anytime we're manipulating habitats, we need to be careful of invasive species. And there's a long list of invasive species that will take over habitats and replace our native species. Japanese honeysuckle and English ivy being two listed here. The rule of thumb is to always be aware of what invasive species are in your area and how to identify them, and always try to control those invasives first. After you have the invasives under control, then come back and plant or fill in with native plants and encourage native species to grow. And if you're managing a piece of property, again, you have to always be aware of and stay on top of maintaining or managing your invasives. Okay. If we're dealing with a lot of smaller habitats, which is frequently found here in the East, Maryland being a primary example, what we can do is take smaller pieces of available wildlife habitat and try to connect those. And by doing that, we create larger habitats and it allows us to maintain more genetic diversity of our wildlife species. Here in Maryland, stream corridors have been identified in previous plans, and the Maryland Greenways program was based upon riparian or stream corridors. By connecting these small properties, we can actually buffer the impacts, and they take on the habitat desires, habitat suitabilities of larger habitats. So, and just pointed out to me, Google Earth is a great tool that you can zoom in and see an example of how these riverine or greenway systems work, and we'll talk about how you can use that later on. So if we don't have currently we don't have good habitat, we can create new habitat. One way to do that is to plant trees. If we're going to plant trees, let's think about species that would be beneficial to our wildlife, for instance those that produce either nuts or berries, and there's a list of a few recommended there. Dogwoods, hollies, oaks are always good, serviceberry. As we plant them, we can plan ahead and actually build those tree plantings into existing forest lands. We do a couple things here. One thing, we're softening the edge for about the first 10 to 20 years by planting these seedlings. The other thing, we're actually going to expand the total amount of forest on the landscape. Similarly, you can take your fields and you can either do field border plantings or you can allow those field borders to grow up. And generally when we talk about field borders, we're talking areas of say 50 to 100 feet into the field. You can set those areas aside, let them grow. Okay, if we're trying to manage or create edge, some of the things that we can do, say we're starting right here with this situation and we have a fairly abrupt hard edge, we could come in and do what we call field border cuts, say go in 50 feet into the forest, cut down the larger trees, maybe create some brush piles, and the net result is over here, and we see a much softer or smoother transition edge in this field habitat. And since we're talking about managing for forest wildlife species, we always want to be conscious of food requirements. Oaks, hickories, walnut, beech are some of the common types of mast we have here in the Appalachian Mountains. Oaks in particular are very important to many of our forest species. And as an example, using the black bear, a black bear can actually double its weight in 3 months when we have a good year of oak production. Soft mass, need to remember that things like cherries, crab apples, and hackberries are also important food sources for wildlife. One thing that is often overlooked is the attractiveness of dead wood for wildlife. And here we see standing snags. Holes may be created by woodpeckers, and these holes are not only going to be are going to create cavities potentially for other animals, other birds to nest in or escape from predators. Dead branches on trees. These dead branches are a great attraction for insects. And what's looking for those insects are insectivorous birds, which will come in. Similarly, hollow trees or rotting logs can be used for dens, such as here with the black bear, or this rotting log being utilized by a salamander. Okay, snags or standing dead trees are very important. We generally recommend to maintain at least 2 to 4 snags per acre. And if you don't currently have that on your property, you can actually create those to maintain a density of 2 to 4. To do so, you can mechanically girdle the trees using a chainsaw. You want to cut at least a ½ inch groove into the smaller trees up to an inch and a half groove for larger trees. You're essentially cutting into the cambium or inner bark layer of the tree to kill it. Okay. You can also use herbicides to kill the trees and let them stand as snags. Another habitat element that's very important are brush piles, and brush piles are frequently overlooked. They provide cover, and especially escape cover for an animal like a cottontail rabbit. They provide nesting sites and loafing areas. And if you're going to build a brush pile, make sure it's large and substantial. We recommend starting out with larger logs, rocks, fence posts, even pipe, anything you have laying around. You want to leave about a 6-inch opening between these large structural logs on the bottom so that it's adequate size to allow a rabbit or something like that to get into, but small enough that a fox, coyote, or other predator can't get in. And then as you add on to that base layer of your brush pile, use finer and finer materials. By locating a brush pile near another habitat feature such as a field or riparian area, you again create more diverse habitat. And the rule of thumb with brush piles is always bigger is better. A 6-foot high, 30-foot diameter brush pile is just about ideal. Another habitat feature that's important to talk about is water. Whether it's a free-flowing stream, whether it's a pond, or maybe just a sediment pond in your development. All living creatures require water. When you're managing property for wildlife, habitat sometimes looks messy, but that's okay. The critters need that dense cover that you see, for instance, on the left-hand side of the screen. It's not a park-like setting. It's not maybe not what you want in your backyard, but this is beneficial for different species of wildlife. You only want to mow areas as needed, okay, to prevent from woody encroachment of woody trees and plants and shrubs. So minimize your mowing. We also want to keep a diverse selection of native plants around all season, and these are important to provide food and habitat for pollinators. Bees and moss are really important to pollinating and allowing our plants and our mass trees and such to produce food. So the big question, what should you manage for? Okay, again, we're going to recommend that you take the landscape perspective, start large and then go smaller. Use your own interest to decide, what you wish to manage for. And as always, it's better and easier to manage for a quality habitat than it is to manage for individual species. You cannot manage for every species of wildlife on every given acre, so you have to make some decisions. One of the recommendations we currently make is you probably want to avoid enhancing the habitat to attract deer. In many places, especially in central and southern Maryland, where we have large deer herds, they're difficult to control because of loss of hunting lands and such. We see high deer densities, and there's been numerous studies done over the year that demonstrate that the higher deer densities we have, the fewer number of songbirds inhabit that same habitat. Similarly, as we increase in deer density, we actually see a dramatic decrease in the amount of ground cover or vegetation that's growing there. Deer are considered to be a keystone species, and what that means is they have the ability to alter their own habitat or the habitat of other species, and so we want to keep their populations in check. Again, we've talked about using Google Earth or maps to look at the landscape perspective. This gives you an example. If we're somewhere in this property outlined in orange and we're thinking about setting aside or managing some property for habitat, we may want to look at some of the adjoining parcel that may have some similar features or things that we're hoping to link up, as you see here with these blue line streams and tributaries and such. And as we keep looking, we find other features. If we can just connect the dots on some of these things, then all of a sudden we're looking at building larger blocks of suitable habitat. A key point is that try to work together with your neighbors, because the more properties you can put together, the larger habitat, the more opportunity you have to attract a greater diversity of wildlife. You see a term there called habitat niches. And when we talk about niches for wildlife, niches are basically functional landscapes that they'll use. And different animals have different niche requirements. Some, for instance, songbirds like to live in the top or the upper canopy of the tree. Others may live in the mid-canopy. Some animals' functional role or niche is to live on the ground or even under the ground. Okay, anytime we're managing for edge or the interspersion of two different habitat types, there's a couple animals that we need to be cognizant of that have really taken advantage of this edge type habitat over the years. Raccoons are very adaptable creatures that do well living next to us in our suburbs and our home sites. They're very tolerant of humans, but their populations they do so well there, the population can increase, and they have dramatic impacts. For instance, upon songbird nests, they like to raid them and eat the eggs. The bird that you see, and there we go in the picture in the lower, is a brown-headed cowbird. And brown-headed cowbirds were initially native to, were native to the Midwest, the prairie settings, and they've migrated to the eastern part of the U.S. They've become very accustomed to living on edges, and they have a particular nesting strategy which is not beneficial to our native songbirds. For instance, you'll see one egg here in the nest that looks very different than the rest. That's a brown-headed cowbird egg. And what happens, they practice something called nest parasitism. They'll find another nest of another songbird, they'll lay their egg in that nest, and as that brown-headed cowbird chick grows, it'll actually outcompete the other nestlings and may actually force them out of the nest. And so the strategy is brown-headed cowbird gets other birds to raise their young, and it's very successful. What we find is that by managing soft edges, we get less nest parasitism from brown-headed cowbirds. Okay, so talking again about managing edge habitat, soft edge provide better cover, more niches, and reduced nest site parasitism or predation. So if we have an existing hard edge here, we want to go ahead and cut or plant approximately, there we go, right here our hard edge. We can plant or let grow a 50 to 100 foot strip here. And again, we'll see our old field succession start to occur, and we'll go from these low growing grasses and forbs up into shrub and later on into a mature forest. Okay, so softening the edge is something we always promote. If we're managing open field areas, for instance pastures, hayfield, even our backyards, it's important to give consideration to the time of mowing or haying. Most songbirds breed and nest between April and August. Here in Maryland, our recommendation is that you don't mow or do your first hay cutting until at least after July 15th to give some of those birds an opportunity to have raised their young and have the young fledge. We also recommend that you only mow a portion of each field every 2 to 4 years, and that maintains and creates habitat patchiness, which provides food and cover for species even adjacent to mown areas. Let's talk now about some habitat techniques for forest stands. One of the common techniques is a timber stand improvement, or TSI. And essentially what we do is we go in, we thin out the overstory, which allows more light to reach the forest floor. It promotes better growth of the existing trees because they now have less competition. It also allows the new forest underneath to start to regenerate. And when we do a TSI, we're always, again, conscious of the fact that we want to save not only our mass-producing species, but at least 2 to 4 cavity or snags per acre. Okay, some examples. If we would go in and we take this area and do a field border cut, as you see right in here, we allow that a few years and we'll get real dense growth in here, real good cover. Similarly, if you have a pine stand on your property or a plantation, by going in and thinning this pine stand, Within the first year, you can see all these grasses and forbs that have come in, and within 4 years, look at the woody growth that's now in here. Lots better wildlife cover than what we see in this typical pond stand. Okay, similarly, if we're doing a logging operation and the logger will have set aside an area essentially as their loading site or their landing, as they cease operations, we recommend that they or you come in and seed down this area with suitable native grass forb, grass legume species, fertilize it, cover it with straw or mulch, and then the result will be some grassy legume areas that are left. We refer to these areas as permanent openings or brood cover, and some species like wild turkey and ruffed grouse require at least some of this habitat within forested area to come out and feed their young when they're very small. Similarly, we can talk about a full canopy removal as opposed to a thinning, and some examples of that would be this 1 acre wildlife opening that was created. Again, we went in, cut all the large trees down, made some brush piles. This 1 acre opening in the forest will basically serve as our log landing did in the previous slide for about the first 3-4 years. Another thing we can do is to come in and do a small clear cut, as you see here within the forest, where we take out all the overstory. And this type of practice is really beneficial to species like ruffed grouse. They require these patchy blocks of younger stage forest stand adjacent to older forest stands. Another practice is called road daylighting. Road daylighting has 2 benefits. We go in and remove the older trees adjacent to the road. Again, we create more of a soft edge, more dense forest cover. It also has the benefit that you get more sunlight onto the roadway, which helps with things like melting ice and also dries the road out quicker after rain events. So for managing field habitats, we can manage them as primarily grass legumes, or we can plant food plots with things such as sorghum, clover, buckwheat. There's a long list of things. If we're going to manage those things, we want to make sure that we're mowing them in strips so that we're not taking out all that grass cover in a given year, and try to practice rotational mowing, which we define as mowing about every 3rd year, and that's about all the more frequent you have to mow to keep out that woody vegetation such as locust. Some other habitat elements that are important, if you can find them, are den trees or cavity trees, and again they'll be used by animals like screech owls, gray squirrels, other species of woodpecker. They're very important. Snags or dead standing trees provide great perches, okay, for instance of birds of prey. If you don't have enough cavity or den trees, you may consider putting up some nest boxes. For instance, you see here these are wood duck nesting boxes. But you can also put up bluebird boxes, you can put up owl boxes, you can put up bat boxes. Another habitat component is called a wolf tree. And depending upon your persuasion, whether you're a forester or a wildlife biologist, you may have a different idea about what to do with wolf trees. From a wildlife perspective, we recommend maintaining wolf trees. They have a large spreading canopy. Generally are older, they still produce some mast or some food. If you're a forester, you may not have that same perspective because the large canopy associated with wolf trees takes up a lot of growing space. And here's some links that we've included, again for rare, threatened, and endangered species here in Maryland, our species list for plants, our invasive and exotics, as well as more information about our game mammals and game birds. Some other links for the University of Maryland Cooperative Extension Service. And finally, any questions? If you do have a question, please type them in now. Be glad to try to answer any of those. And we have a question up about white nose disease of bats. And white nose disease, or white nose syndrome as it's called, is currently believed to be caused by a fungal infection. It started in the northeast of the United States, and within just a few years has spread dramatically, heading both south, southeast, and west. In large bat colonies, you find that the disease is really killing a lot of bats. And what happens when the bats go into hibernate, they generally have their fat stored because bats that are insectivorous can't go out and feed on insects in the winter because they're not present. Well, the fungus appears to make them use up their energy resources and wake up early. The bats emerge from their caves hungry, in a starved condition, try to feed, but of course there's no food source out there. So it's not uncommon to find this time of the year, say, bats at or near cave entrances where they come out looking for insects that weren't available, and essentially the bats have starved. Have another question on recommendations for controlling Phragmites in wooded areas. And I have to admit, I do know a little bit about Phragmites, but I'm the western region biologist for Maryland DNR, and we don't have any frag in the western region. What I'd suggest is get on our DNR website, and under the invasive species section we do have a lot of information about controlling frag and some contacts that are more specialized in that particular area. Okay. Yeah, we have a question up about thinning some dense white pine trees, and my recommendation would be to contact your county forester with Maryland DNR Forest Service, and they may refer you to another private consulting forester, but that's their area of expertise. But any thinning that you do definitely will improve habitat, as you saw evidence of in our slides. Any other questions? Oh, we got one more up. Yeah. Yeah, and there's an observation about my recommendation of 50 to 100 foot to leave as a field border. And certainly with farmers and commodity prices, you know, they're struggling to get by. That's asking to take a lot out of production. The observation was if you get 35 to 50, you're lucky. And again, we'll gladly take what we can get for wildlife habitat. Any more questions? Please type them in now. Okay. I have a question about pond management, and again, my area of expertise is wildlife management. I'd suggest you contact our local fisheries biologist or your soil conservation district office. Both of those have a lot of experience in dealing with ponds. All right, thank you very much. Again, if you have additional questions, please send them in, and folks from University of Maryland Cooperative Extension Service will get right back to you. Okay.
All right, this is Jonathan Kays again. I just want to take a minute of your time, if I would, just to have you fill out go through just a very quick evaluation. You'll see on the screen, I have a couple questions for you. The first is right here. Indicate the level of knowledge gained from this webinar. These are just a couple of questions. There's 5 questions. I'd appreciate it. Helps us out a great deal to get feedback from you all. And that's great. The other question here is has to do with sharing your knowledge with others. So if you would indicate, I plan to share the knowledge or skills I've learned with family, friends, or people on my job. And close that poll. Perhaps more importantly is, do you plan to implement some of what you've learned perhaps on your own property? And we always ask this question because we just wonder if maybe wildlife it's a little less pertinent to some things, but if this webinar thinks it had maybe save you any money in terms of over the next year with things that you might do, savings that you might have. And finally, the last question is, do you think you might encourage others to view the recording of this webinar? And I kind of asked that question mainly just because many times people forget that they are recorded and that they are available. So with that, I want to thank Jim for taking his time to come here. And the webinar recording should be posted probably in the next couple of days. So with that, we hope that you come back for our next webinar, which is in March, and visit our website. And thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate it.